Dear participants, today's session is dedicated to climate change and its relation with pandemics. COVID-19 is the most recent pandemic which has knocked down the entire globe. Politicians have called this pandemic a once-in-a-century crisis. But scientists have warned that the ongoing disturbance of species through human activities and climate change could be raising the risk of potentiality pandemic causing diseases passing from animals to humans. It is likely that climate change and the disturbance of biodiversity could play a role in shaping the frequency, timing, and location of these meetings. Climate change is clearly a factor that can influence these relationships. Climate change shapes the biogeographical distribution of species. If in the nature we see species moving into areas where humans are prevalent, we could see new opportunities for pandemics to evolve. The discussion of today's session revolves around the climate change impact on the human health, which is one of the potent sectors as far as the pandemics are concerned. Climate change mainly alters the distribution of some infectious disease vectors. A significant role is played by such spreads in the human history, impacting the rise and fall of civilizations. Plague outbreaks in Rome in the 2nd century BCE and Athens in the 5th century BCE are reported in the biblical records. And the Black Death epidemic which struck Europe during the 14th century wiped out between a third and a half of European population. More recently, in 2014-2016, the largest yet observed Ebola outbreak and Zika virus outbreak devastated the vulnerable populations, and yet again the one and only COVID pandemic of 2020 has brought the entire globe on knees. The session discusses the seasonal distribution of some allergenic pollen species in relation to climate change. Allergic diseases have been increasing in prevalence over the last decades, partly as the result of the impact of climate change. There is now compelling evidence that rising air temperatures and carbon dioxide concentrations lengthen the pollen season. Changes in extreme events such as thunderstorms and tropical cyclones will also have impacts on allergic diseases. For example, the flooding associated with tropical cyclones leads to proliferation of mold growths in damp homes. Discussion further moves to the increased heat wave related deaths. Occasional heat waves have always been an aspect of summer weather, but as climate change makes heat waves more intense and more frequent, we need to be cognizant of the dangers and health risks that comes with it. Pathways by which climate change affects human health is further discussed. The more direct impacts on health include those due to changes in exposure to weather extremes such as heat waves, winter cold, and increased production of certain air pollutants and aeroallergens such as the spores and the molds. Climate change acting via less direct mechanisms would affect the transmission of many infectious diseases, especially water, food and vector-borne diseases, and regional food productivity, especially at the cereal grains. In the longer term, and with considerable variation between populations as a function of geography and vulnerability, these indirect impacts are likely to have greater magnitude than the direct. For vector-borne infections, the distribution and abundance of vector organisms and intermediate hosts are affected by various physical and biotic factors. The session then furthers to climate change signature and health impacts. Some of these health impacts have a clear climate change signature, such as the increasing frequency and strength of extreme weather events or the expanding range and spread of vector-borne diseases like malaria and dengue. For others, such as COVID-19 pandemic, the connection with climate change is less clear-cut. The session then narrows down to the climate change and coronavirus. It draws parallels and parity between the two, showing how the two are being interceded. We are living through the biggest carbon crash ever recorded. No war, no recession, no previous pandemic has had such a dramatic impact on emissions of carbon dioxide over the past century as COVID-19 has had in a few short months. Multiple sources indicate we are now living through an unrivaled drop in the carbon output. Even though we will see a massive fall this year, the concentrations of carbon dioxide that are in the atmosphere and warming our planet won't stabilize until the world reaches the net zero. The session then mulls on lessons drawn from COVID-19 and climate change. There are majorly four lessons learned. First, it points that well-resourced, equitable health systems with a strong and supported health workforce are essential to protect us from health security threats, including climate change. The austerity measures that have strained many national health systems over the past decade will have to be reversed if economies and societies are to be resilient and prosperous in an age of change. Secondly, the ongoing pandemic illustrates how inequality is a major barrier in ensuring the health and well-being of people. Creating healthy environments for healthier populations and promoting universal health coverage are the most effective ways in which long-term health impacts can be drawn. This would also help to increase the resilience and adaptive capacity to both the coronavirus pandemic and climate change. The third lesson drawn is that it is high time there is a need to dramatically change our behavior in order to protect ourselves and those around us. This temporary shift of gears could lead to a long-term shift in old behaviors and assumptions, which could lead to a public drive for collective action and effective risk management. Even though climate change presents a slower, more long-term health threat, an equally dramatic and sustained shift in behavior will be needed to prevent irreversible damage. Lastly, crises like these offer an opportunity for a regained sense of shared humanity, in which people realize what matters most, that is the health and the safety of their loved ones. Both the climate crisis and unfolding pandemic threaten this one thing we all care about. We need to rebuild our social and economic systems to make them better, more resilient and compassionate. The financial and support packages to maintain and eventually revive the global economy post-pandemic should therefore promote health, equity and environmental protection. Ultimately, public health is a political choice, a choice we are now confronted with, and one we will have to make over and over again as we transit to a more resilient, zero carbon, just and a healthier future. The session then highlights the trends of dramatic falls in carbon dioxide. There have been many events in the past when carbon dioxide went down, ranging from global recessions in the early 1980s that followed the oil crisis of the late 1970s. But the coronavirus pandemic of 2020 dwarfs all of these previous shocks by some distance. In a few months, demand from energy globally has fallen off the cliff. The International Energy Agency says that the world will use 6% less energy this year, which is equivalent to losing the entire energy demand of India. The scenario further dwells on what if scenario. What if carbon dioxide was cut like this each year to keep the world on track to say under 1.5 degrees Celsius? The world needs similar cuts for the foreseeable future to keep this target in view. It is believed that there will be a bounce back next year, but that long term the world will move to greener fuels. The session furthers to challenge of keeping the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. It may not be enough to keep temperatures down to safer levels, as this downward slope will accelerate over time. That doesn't chime with the 1.5 degrees Celsius, but maybe 1.8 to 1.9 degrees Celsius could be within the reach, and this situation right now would help achieve that. Many climate researchers are optimistic that this deadly pandemic has taught governments some critical lessons that they can aptly apply to the problem of rising temperatures. The big challenge is to ensure the recovery, and which has a green focus too.